find it intriguing that around the world every summer, along coastline states and other countries, even on coastlines, they hold elaborate contests every year in the summer months on their beaches. Some sandcastle tournaments offer cash prizes of $10,000 and more. In fact, I looked this up online. Some of the winners from this year's competition featured exquisite, beautiful artistry. It's amazing what they can do with sand. Some of the entries this year were huge in scope and size. They were palaces made of sand and water. Every year, thousands of people come to look at these and watch these contestants as they create these masterpieces along the shore. What's really remarkable to me is that they can be built in such a short time. Doesn't take long at all. Typically, the contest begins, around 9 a.m. and runs until late afternoon. The contestants choose their place on the beach, and then they start from scratch. But they've got to finish their creative masterpieces around 3 o'clock in the afternoon so their entries can be judged. And that's because someone else is going to show up to take a close look at these castles. He never fails to show up right on time, and when he does, everything stops. We call it the tide. The tide is coming in. And when it arrives, all the sandcastles and creative masterpieces are washed away. The English word for tide originally referred to a portion of time. In fact, time and tide are cousins in their etymology. A tide originally referred to a season of time. We use that idea even to this day. We talk about good tidings. What we mean is this is a season when good things are going to happen, good events. It's a season that makes us glad. The King James Version records the angels, you remember, arriving to deliver to the shepherds good tidings of great joy. In other words, we're going to tell you about some good things that are coming. It's a season that makes us joyful. In Old English, the word tide also carried the idea that not only was something going to happen, but that it was predictable. It was certain. In fact, it was as certain as the rising and falling of the ocean tides, which is why they use the word tide to refer to that event. The tide was an expected, predictable, always on time event. And there wasn't anything any sandcastle could ever do to avoid the tide. No matter how beautiful or elaborate, no matter how creative or magnificent, the tide was on its way. This happens to be the idea that is keeping Solomon awake at night. The fact that there's an event that's going to happen, it's going to happen to everybody. It's going to be right on time, whatever that time is for it to arrive. It's expected. The hour's unknown. The event is as predictable as the ocean's tide. Doesn't matter, by the way, if people spend their time making sandcastle masterpieces or just pouring piles of sand out of a plastic pail. This event cannot be rescheduled. The tide is going to come in. Solomon describes his frustration about this event here in his journal. If you were with us in our last study in Ecclesiastes chapter 2, Solomon asks the question, is there anything I can do? Is there anything I can experience that would allow me to hang on to happiness? And the answer, of course, was no. Now Solomon asks another question where we arrive today, and this question is this. Is there any advantage to living wisely rather than living wildly? Let's pick it up at chapter 2 of Ecclesiastes and verse 12. So I turned to consider wisdom and madness and folly. For what can the man do who comes after the king? Only what has already been done. Now what Solomon does is he turns his attention to a new train of thought. So I turned my attention to consider something a little different. What are the advantages of wisdom as opposed to wild living? By the way, the combination in your text of the words madness and folly are not two different ideas. He combines them in his journal to basically describe the wildest, craziest kind of life you could ever experience. And notice that Solomon suggests that there isn't any man who will come after him who is able to experience either wise living or wild living like he's been able to experience. So the question he turns his mind to consider is this: is living a moderate, prudent, moral life any better than living a wild life? Which commercial is right? Early to bed, early to rise makes a man healthy, wealthy, and wise. Or you only go around once in life, so grab all the gusto you can. Make it as wild as you can possibly make it. Which direction is going to be better? Well, I have to tell you that even though most of his journal up to this point is rather negative and jaded, and you're not sure you're going to memorize any of these verses, his answer is going to surprise you. Look at verse 13. Then I saw that there is more gain in wisdom than in folly, and there is more gain in light than in darkness. In other words, using your head is smarter than running wild. And you're thinking right now at this point, way to go, Solomon. I might memorize. I might let my kids read this verse out of his journal. There is more gain in wisdom. The word gain is a commercial term. There's more profit. There are more advantages, you could render it. There's an advantage to avoiding the wild and crazy life. Go to the jail and interview people, or the halfway house, or whatever. There's a disadvantage to that kind of living. In fact, Solomon equates folly with darkness here. He equates wisdom with light. And what he does next is he writes one of those proverbs again. He just sort of drops it in, verse 14. The wise person has his eyes in his head, but the fool walks in darkness. What does he mean? The wise person has his eyes in his head. He means he has both eyes open. He has 20/20 vision. The fool is walking through life as if in a fog. We would describe him today by saying something like, well, that guy's in the dark. Same idea. The light bulb's not on in the attic. Same idea. He's not thinking. One author commented on the history of this Hebraism, this Hebrew proverb, and he said, in my language, and he was German, he said, we have a similar idea that says the same thing. We say it this way, translated into English: he who wants to play chess had better not keep his eyes in his pocket. Which is sort of a silly way of saying life, like the game of chess, requires that you keep both eyes open. Stay alert. My grandmother taught me that. She taught me how to play chess. And one of the things she taught me was that I'd better stay alert, because she might have been an older woman. She might have been my grandmother. But when it came to the game of chess, she was bloodthirsty. She was vicious. She was unmerciful. Well, you get the idea, all those things. She would look over her little glasses at me eventually, and she'd say, check. And then I'd take my king and my 2 pawns, which is all I would have left, and I would race around the board trying to stay alive. And finally, I'd get cornered, and she'd start cackling like the Wicked Witch of the West. And she would say that dreaded word through her long fangs. checkmate. It's taken years of counseling, but I think I'm over it. Not sure. It's a pretty good life lesson. You got to keep both eyes open. The fool, on the other hand, is in constant trouble. By the way, the term fool is not related to IQ. Doesn't mean he dropped down to second grade. It's used by Solomon 18 times in his private journal we call Ecclesiastes. And it refers to a person who lives an evil, self-centered, God-dishonoring life. The fool, in Solomon's mind, is somebody who doesn't have their moral headlights on. They're driving in the dark and they're constantly totaling their lives. The only thing they seem to be looking for is the next opportunity to sin. Maybe somebody like that you work with. They can't wait for the weekend. It gives them, about 48 hours to turn the lights off and just go total their lives all over again. Solomon says that's the foolish person. And so the only thing they look for is sin. So back to the question, is there an advantage to living wisely or foolishly? And Solomon says, yes, there's an advantage to living wisely. And before you go to Solomon and you say, I'm so glad to see you taking a turn in your journal, I might read this for devotions after all. Solomon would say, not so fast. He records, notice verse 14, the wise person has his eyes in his head, but the fool walks in darkness. Now notice, and yet, but, on the other hand, here's what I've realized. I perceived that the same event, the same happening, the same predictable moment, like the tide, happens to us all. Verse 15, then I said, in my heart, what happens to the fool will happen to me also. Why then have I been so wise? And what is the event that will happen to both the wise and the fool? Skip down to the last part of verse 16. The wise dies just like the fool. Solomon essentially says this eliminates any advantage after all, so do whatever you want to do. Build an elaborate sand castle or play in the sand, whatever. The tide is coming in for us all. Solomon adds two observations here that affect us all. And again, he's telling us the brutal truth, whether we want to hear it or not. First, no matter what you do, your accomplishments are forgettable. Isn't that encouraging? Here's the brutal fact of life. Notice verse 16. For the wise as of the fool, there is no enduring remembrance, seeing that in the days to come all will have long been forgotten. Now, if you've been with us, you notice that sounds familiar to chapter 1 and verse 11, where he says generations come and go, and the generations that come along forget what the generations prior to them did. He's not trying to be mean. He's not trying to rub your nose in it. He's painfully honest. Our lives will be forgotten. In fact, in my research, I read an article by a genealogist, and they commented that the average person does not know the names of the members of their families beyond 4 generations. Think about it. I think even for me, that's further back than I know. You know the names of your parents, we would hope, right? You might know the names of your grandparents. How about your great-grandparents? What about your great-great-grandparents? I mean, they're why you're here, for goodness sake. And you not only don't know their names more than likely, if you're the average person in this audience, but you don't know what they did. You don't know what they built. You don't know what they accomplished. They have been forgotten. See, Solomon he's living at a time where he already knows what's going on over in Egypt and how the pharaohs lived. You know, they had the habit of chiseling out the name of their predecessor on some grand monument and chiseling their name onto it. In fact, they wanted to forget their predecessors as soon as they bit the dust. Egyptian texts written around the same time Solomon lived, which had been excavated, read, and I quote, here's one going back to the days of Solomon. Those who built pyramids are soon forgotten. Those who were once gods lie forgotten in their tombs. See, here's the brutal truth. One day, 3 generations later, 4 generations later, maybe sooner, maybe later, no one on the planet is going to remember you. They're not going to remember the sand castle you built. They're not going to remember the fact that you won first place in that contest. Why? Because the tide is going to come in and it's going to render this irreversible judgment. No matter what you do, your accomplishments are forgettable. Secondly, Solomon adds, no matter who you are, your death is unavoidable. Notice the exclamation point in verse 16. How the wise dies just like the fool. No matter how smart you are, no matter how much you have, no matter how big your sandcastle, how many garages it has, no matter how much income you bring in, no matter how much toys you got stuffed in the attic, the bumper sticker was wrong that says, the man with the most toys wins. It ought to read, Solomon would write it this way, the man with the most toys still dies. That's what he's saying. I was buying a car this past week. It's a Mustang. Went faster than my pickup truck, which bothered me a little bit. But at any rate, before he peeled off, his license plate read, hell bound. And I wondered, does he realize that the tide eventually is going to come in? You see, with the shadow of death reflecting back on his life, Solomon comes to these conclusions. Let me give you 3 of them very quickly. Number 1, life has become disgusting. Look at verse 17, just the first phrase. So I hated life. He's not the kind of guy you'd want to have lunch with. So I hated life. You could paraphrase this to read, therefore I was disgusted with life. He's angry about it. Think of the castles he's built. I mean, goodness gracious. He's come to the realization that no matter how long he lives, no matter how wise he is, how creative he's been, he's going to die just like the guy that lived a wild and crazy life. He might live a little longer, but he's going to inhabit a tomb somewhere eventually. Just like the fool, and that makes him angry. Makes him angry. One article records the effort of a man as rich as Solomon. He's living today. He's already poured $40 million into a medical foundation to understand, quote, lifespan development processes. In other words, how can we avoid that tide just a little longer? Nothing wrong with that. His net worth exceeds now $55 billion. Yet Larry Ellison said this in an interview, and I quote him, death makes me angry. It doesn't make any sense to me. Death has never made any sense to me. How can a person be there and then just vanish and not be there? It disgusts me. There are more sandcastles to build. There are more experiences to have. There are more things to taste. I see the tide coming. It disgusts me and what I'm trying to enjoy. Solomon adds, life has not only become disgusting, secondly, he concludes life has become distasteful. Verse 17 again, so I hated life because what is done under the sun was grievous to me. That Hebrew word grievous can be rendered distasteful. unpleasant. In fact, it's a Hebrew word used for bitter herbs, even poisonous herbs. Solomon is saying, life down here under the sun is like one meal of bitter herbs after another. Nothing tastes good. When I think about the tide coming in, I can't enjoy my dessert. He's telling the truth. It's become distasteful. He goes on to add, thirdly, life has become disheartening. See, under the sun, all is vanity, he writes, and it's striving after wind. He's already talked like this before, hasn't he? He reaches the same conclusion. If there are no pockets in shrouds, as the Jewish proverb says, as George Strait, the country westerner, sings, you ain't never seen a hearse with a luggage rack on top. If that's true, as Billy Graham would coin it to say, you never see a hearse pulling a U-Haul to a cemetery plot. And no matter what you can try to stuff in your pockets, all you've done in the end is chase after the wind, and in the end you've caught nothing, and that coastline is scraped clean once again by the tide. For the believer, the follower of Christ, life can be disgusting and distasteful and disheartening at times. Solomon is telling the truth here, but he's not telling the whole truth. You remember, he's stuck down here with his perspective under the sun. That's all he can see. He never goes any higher than that. Keep in mind, you have to understand Ecclesiastes. If you're new to this study, you got to understand it backwards. You got to keep pulling Solomon's grand conclusion, his final conclusion in chapter 12, back into these observations about life. Remember your Creator. Remember your Creator. Don't forget your Creator. Look above the sun and see the sun, S-O-N. You see, if you don't belong by faith to the Creator who reigns above the sun, then you're stuck down here building nothing more permanent than a sandcastle. You're chasing after the wind. You're without any rescue, without any Redeemer, without any hope. Because you can't cheat the tide. You can't avoid the tide. You can't outlast the tide. You won't outlive the tide. The tide is coming in. But you can, by faith in Jesus Christ, one day rise above the tide. Jesus said, I am the resurrection and the life. Whoever believes in me, even though he dies, he will yet live. How? For God so loved the world of humanity, stuck down here under the sun, that he gave his only begotten Son, who came down here to live among us and to live a perfect life among us here under the sun, and even to die under the sun. And whoever believes in him should not perish, but have everlasting life. Do you know him? In his private journal, and I close with this, another preacher wrote this. His name was John Wesley. He entered this into his journal on January 2nd, 1777, as a 66-year-old man. He wrote, I have begun expounding on the book of Ecclesiastes. I never before had so clear a sight of the meaning or the beauty of it. Neither did I imagine that its parts were so connected together, all ending to prove that grand truth: there is no happiness outside of God. Everything else